All right. Any questions? Cool. Okay, so today we're going to talk about a bunch of different things. Look at we'll look at some newer features of CSS3. We'll look at some positioning stuff, all that kind of thing. So, I don't want that. All right. So let's start with animations. So prior to CSS3, pretty much anytime you wanted anything to move or animate, etc., you basically had to resort to using JavaScript for doing so. And even today, there might be reasons for using JavaScript for animations. However, for kinds of animations, oftentimes you can get away with actually with using some of the new CSS3 features. Places where you would want to use JavaScript for it are if you have more elaborate animations, if you need some sort of user interaction with various things, if you need a sort of fine-grained control over what's happening and all of that. So as when we start talking about JavaScript, we'll see that stuff. But for now, let's just talk about looking at that in terms of CSS. All right, so let me create a file. I'll call it anim HTML. You know what? Let me do this. Let me call it. All right. So there's a number of different things that you can animate, different properties and so forth. What I'm going to show is one sort of animation that you might see in something like a navigation section. So presumably I would have this actually in a navigation section, and of course we typically create this using our ULs, creating an unordered list. All right, let me create a couple of these. So we'll create 4 of these, and I want an A tag that has an href that basically just doesn't point anywhere, and we'll just put some numbered text in there just to make it nice and easy. All right. So there's our individual links, okay? And so right now basically we have there it is. Okay. So basic our regular little links, just like we expect links to look like. They're underlined, etc. We can kind of style these up further. So what I'm going to do here is, as I talked about last time, most of the time generally what you want to do is to have a separate style sheet. For a lot of what I'm going to show today, I'm actually just going to keep it in the same HTML file so that hopefully there's less jumping around in terms of file to file. So for demonstration purposes, that's what I'm going to do, but generally we would put this in a separate file. All right, so I'll create a style section. So we can use a pseudo selector like so. The hover pseudo selector basically determines when the mouse is over a particular item, right? So a hover, and so we could do things like, for instance, I don't know, we could say, let's make the background color. I don't know. How about there? Okay, so let's take a look at that. Right, and so you'll see basically as I hover over the individual links, we immediately get that feedback of the link context and it being sort of highlighted, so to speak. Okay, but these days our users are more sophisticated, right? They want websites that basically feel like desktop applications. Okay, so while that's kind of cool, we could put a little bit more polish on this. That is, we can have that change in background essentially animated. Okay, and the way that we do this, it's almost a little backwards. So first, what we need to do is then specify on the links themselves that we're going to allow we're going to do transitions. Okay, so we use the transition property here, and basically we'll say, oh, so you can do a couple of things. In this case, since we know that what we're doing is we are changing the background, we can specify that yes, we are going to do a transition on the background. You can also specify a duration of the transition. So I'll say, for instance, 2 seconds. You can also do various kinds of easing. So that is, it will sort of start off a little bit faster and then slow down and so on and so forth. So there's ease in, ease out, all of that. But we'll just do this, right? So you'll notice it's actually here on the A tag, not on the hover part. That's the only part that I think is a little counterintuitive. Okay, so just this much basically gives us that. Ooh. Yeah, it's stupid, but notice, I mean, that's the kind of nice little polish that gives you that kind of final look and all of that. Okay, so fairly simple to basically build in little animations like that for highlighting and so forth, and so you can sort of play around further with those things. All right. Now to some of the nastiness. So let me go back. Let's do. Call this a side one. All right. So we talked before about the fact that browsers tend to have built into them certain style rules, sort of default style rules for a number of tags that are built into HTML. And that with HTML5, we had the addition of further semantic tags that were essentially derived by looking at HTML in the wild and sort of pulling out what people thought the developers were in fact intending. So one of these things is the aside. And I think I showed this before, right? So the idea behind an aside is that it's some additional content, typically sort of pulled off to the side of the page, that isn't necessarily that sort of is a bonus add to the content, but isn't critical to understanding the main content. A lot of times this is also used for things like ads and so forth, and so you get the idea. Yeah, let's throw some lorem in there. All right, there we go. There's our aside, and so then let's get our main content. So. And so there that is. All right, so let's take a look at what that looks like. And you'll notice our aside is not on the side. Okay? There is no default rendering for asides to automatically push it to the side for us. Okay? So, how do we do this? Anybody? Pardon?
CSS?
Well, yes, you use CSS, but what are we going to use in CSS? Yes? Floats, right? So, ostensibly one of the oldest mechanisms in CSS for doing this is called floating. Okay, and so basically, here's what it looks like. Right, so I'll throw a style tag in here, and then I can do something like the following. So I can say, all right, for our aside, we're going to float it, and I'm going to throw it over on the right. And then generally we want to specify roughly a width for this particular entity. Now you may be tempted to do something like the following. Bad. Okay. Why is that bad? Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming basically that there's sort of a certain amount of screen real estate that's going to be at my disposal. So minimally, I'm assuming that we have at least 300 pixels sort of extra on top of whatever pixels we're going to use for the main content. Right, that might be the case. You know, if I'm if you're sitting at home with a 55-inch 4K screen resolution monitor, then yeah, you probably have plenty of screen real estate for this. How about these things? How about these things in that orientation? Yeah, no. Right. So. Most of the time, we generally don't want to specify in terms of raw pixel values. One thing we can do is just specify essentially a % of the overall viewport. Okay. So here I'm going to say, all right, our aside's going to take up roughly 30% of the page. So let's take a look at that. Let's say saved, yes, and there it is. Our side is on the side. Okay. And then we can, do other kinds of styling on this as well. So I could do stuff like, let's say, give it some sort of background. Let's say it's light gray, and maybe I want a border that is, let's see, thin, and let's do dotted. And black. Right. And there it is, right? So it gets offset, and we see there's our border, there's our background. Now, admittedly, you can also see this doesn't quite look all that great because we don't really have much space between the border and the content itself, right? We can fix that using padding. Right. So padding, I'm actually going to do it this way. What's that? Really? Come on, all you guys have, I saw all kinds of CSS files submitted. Nobody knows M's? Right. So the measurement M is roughly the width of the letter M in the particular font rendering. Okay? So it's another way of specifying sizing information relative to your content without having to specify raw pixel values. Okay? And so, okay, I don't know if it's saved. There it is, now it's saved. Right? And yeah, notice we get that moved along and so forth. Now, notice also, so I have kind of this big space there and so forth. So I actually might have a little bit more space on the top than I necessarily wanted. For things like padding and so forth, you can actually do things like this. So for instance, I could say, oh, okay, padding on top. Maybe I want 0M. Right, and then I could do things like padding on the left side, I want 2M, etc. Just to kind of see what that looks like. right? Like so. You can combine all of these things. So if you just use padding by itself, like we did originally, what this basically says is the padding for all of the regions, that is, the top, the left, the bottom, and the right, are all 2M. Okay, like so. Which is why we're kind of getting this extra space here. There's also another version of this, and I always forget which it is. I'm always wrong when I guess too. It's probably the other way. Yeah, exactly. So this starts at the top and goes clockwise around. So basically, this first one says that's for the top and the bottom. This says it's for the right and the left. And so we get that. So now you can see that we have kind of a more equal kind of spacing around things and so forth. Give you kind of an idea of the pickiness that sometimes you need to deal with and so forth. Okay. One other thing about this. Let me show you another quick property. This is one from CSS3, order radius. So let me do something like that, and yeah, nice rounded corners, right? So depending on the particular style of the day, we can do lots of different things here. There are drop shadowing mechanisms and all of these kinds of things as well. Again, all built into CSS3. Okay, which is really powerful because generally CSS is rendered nice and quick. We don't have to worry about for instance, if you are using JavaScript for these kinds of things in the past, where you may have used JavaScript for these kinds of things, the big problem is, suppose somebody turns JavaScript off. Right? So you might have some form of ad blocker, etc., installed on the machine, or you just have JavaScript turned off in general. In that case, you sort of lose that look that you would get from JavaScript. Right? Here, it's built right into the CSS. So very nice. Questions about that much? Now, let me show you a couple of issues with floats. Floats are finicky. I could also here, if I really wanted to, I could also sort of wrap my main content here in some sort of tag to denote that that's the main content. So I could do something like grab all of this here and do the Control-Shift-A, and there is the main tag for doing such a thing. And then let's see. There it is. All right. And notice that doesn't actually, again, putting in main doesn't actually change the overall look, but that does give me actually a thing to grab onto the main content for, is a handle to grab onto the main content for. So, for instance, if I wanted to style that in a particular way, again, I could add additional padding for that one. So we get something that looks sort of like that. We could also specify a particular width. So I could say, okay, I want that to roughly be 70% of the viewport, and we get that accordingly. But here's the thing about the finickiness of floats, and also should show you the finickiness of front-end web developers. So here's the thing to consider. Take a look at my markup. So in my markup here, in the structure of my document, after our top-level heading, H1, what's the first thing in terms of the content? It's an aside. So the first thing is not the most important thing, right? It's not the main content. It's the side content. Now you might say, so what? I mean, what were you, toilet trained at gunpoint? Who cares about that? One of the reasons we care has to do, again, with things like accessibility, screen readers, right? So a person who's reading, who is viewing this web page using a screen reader that essentially reads the content of the page to them, well, the screen reader, the first content it gets, again, is not the most critical part. The other thing, again, has to do with that sort of concern and that worry about how fast the content is loading on the page, right? And again, the first thing that gets loaded is the aside, not the main content. Which totally seems backwards. So, okay, fine. Let's move it. So we'll grab our aside, and I'll drop it down here, like so. Crap. So that sucks. Now you might say, well, okay, well you could float something to the left, so couldn't we just change it to float? I'm sorry, you could float to the right, so can't you float something to the left? That is, couldn't we float main content to the left and then get this ordering? Sure, but then suppose we have a navigation sequence in there too that we want that we want to make this 3 columns, and now you're kind of getting into icky territory. Okay, and yeah, there's different workarounds and all that, but for the most part, you end up having these kind of weird little trade-offs and so on and so forth. Because we're really trying to push floats to do a job that they weren't exactly designed to do to begin with. As I said, floats are a really, really old positioning technology. Okay. So today, in modern CSS, CSS3, there's other mechanisms for dealing with this type of content. Okay. So, for instance, let me do this. Let me do a save as, and so we'll call this aside 2. So, another way of dealing with positioning is with a new feature in CSS3 known as flex locks. Incidentally, there's actually a third one that really is the holy grail solution for all of this, which is grid, which is part of the CSS3 specification, but almost no current browsers actually implement it. Okay, and so we should actually talk about some of these things. So you will see, again, if you read, if you look up various things on web development, front-end web development, dealing with CSS, etc., you will see lots of discussions of things like polyfills and backward compatibility, right? So what's all that stuff about? Okay, so a polyfill basically is code to sort of backport new features to old, ostensibly out-of-date browsers, right? So typically, things like IE6 and 7 and stuff like that, really, really old versions of Internet Explorer that people are still trying to support for some unknown reason. My personal view is, hey, browsers are cheap, they're free, just download a new browser, damn it. But admittedly, yeah, there are times when you do have to actually be concerned about these kinds of things, especially something like Grid. Grid's really on the bleeding edge of the technology. According to W3C, basically it's experimental technology still. So what that means is, like I said, the current crop of browsers don't necessarily, even the latest versions don't necessarily support it. And then if you consider people places, companies and such where they tend to not update their browsers because, well, their ERM system only works with IE6, and so therefore they're not upgrading their browsers ever. Yeah, I mean, sometimes you do have use cases where you have to be concerned about that. Flexbox, however, has been in the standard long enough that that it basically is in most of the current browsers for a number of versions. So it's at the point where it's fairly safe to actually use. And I would imagine probably in a year or two, when I'm teaching this class, I'll be teaching Grid because Grid will be well implemented there. All right, so let's look at Flexbox, or a little bit of Flexbox, and kind of how to use that, what it kind of gives you, and those kinds of things. All right, so let's see. So basically, what you want first of all is a container for the things that are going to be part of the flexible layout. Okay, so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to wrap our stuff. I'm just going to wrap it up in a div. So notice I grab the entire page content and wrap this in a div, and I'm going to give it a class, and I can name the class whatever. I'm just going to call it container. Okay. So you see, there's our div. That we're now wrapping the main part of most of the content of our page. The only thing that I haven't thrown in there is our main H1 header. Okay. Now, I'm going to get rid of these float things for right now. Get rid of width. All right, so dot container, and let's see, it's display flex. Okay, so that's basically how you turn Flexbox on. Now let's see what that gives us. Go over here. Voila, out of the box, it just works. Okay. And so notice, it basically splits this up roughly 50-50 for my individual content. Okay. Now, by default, the layout for Flexbox is this horizontal layout, or what's known as the row layout. Furthermore, in terms of how it positions, again, notice this is the same markup that broke our float-based code, right? So this markup, you'll notice I have my main content first, followed by my aside. So this is a lot of the issues that we were seeing. Now, if you want sort of to break things up into separate sections, I could use the various width options, but actually Flexbox has another option for us. Okay, so there's the flex property, and let's see. So I could do something like, let's say I wanted 3 and. Say here, I wanted 6. Okay. So it's a 6-3 or a 2-to-1 weighting in terms of which content is more important. Okay. Pretty cool. Just kind of figures it out for you. Okay. Now. There are other properties as well. So you can, for instance, deal with different kinds of ordering on Flexbox and so forth. Where's my little cheat sheet here? Hang on. That's it. Question?
Are those flex numbers, do they add up to any computer?
No, not necessarily, right? So I mean, so notice I could do 1 to 2, right? And so it's basically giving it, so you're essentially giving hints to roughly the general importance. If I had three columns, for instance, I could you know, again, specify out in terms of the different things and all that. The ordering. So, for instance, here on the container, I can specify the flex direction. Okay. Now, notice. So here are the options for it. So there's column and column reversed, and row reversed. Okay. So the default is row. That's why we're getting them organized that way. Let me show you row reverse. Again, based on the order that you specified, so essentially it takes sort of that last content that we specified and puts that thing first. You can also specify individual index numbers for your content as well, again, to kind of get them to take control of that. Alternatively, we could do column. Gives me that. Right? Or, of course, then I could do column reverse, which is going to throw the aside up above my main content. Not too bad. All right. Questions about that much? Flexbox has a ton of options. There are justification. There's various alignment types of things. There's a whole bunch of stuff that Flexbox allows you to do in terms of positioning and all of those kinds of things. Now, I'm going to show you some more with that, but actually it occurred to me that there was one other thing I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about back here, right? So back here, right, with our transition page, you'll recall, so, you know, we have here's transitions, right? So we have our little links here under the navigation section, our menu section, and we have our little transitions and so forth. But here's part of the issue that we're going to have with how we've written this code so far. Notice how I say we then when I imply that it's broken, right? It's not that I broke it; it's that we collectively broke it. Yeah. All right. Anyways. So let me add a couple more. Actually, it doesn't even have to be. Right, so here I have some links. We have our nice little transition scheme going on. Then I have this, and notice I also have the same transition scheme going on. Now, you may or may not want that. Oftentimes, typically, whatever transitions and setups that you're doing for your navigation, you may not actually want to happen in the rest of your content. Okay? How can we fix this so that we don't have that? What's that? Class? Yeah, we could add a class or ID, right? So I could basically come in here, and for each of these for each of my anchor tags, I could add a class to specify that those are the ones that are being used for our navigation versus the other ones. Sure. What else?
We can use the tags A that are children of the UL.
Yeah. So, you know, what we could, so one thing we could do is say, oh, okay, if we're actually dealing with an anchor that's inside a UL, maybe then we're okay. But realistically, I could actually in my main content also have an unordered list of links. What would be better? Yeah. Nav to the rescue, right? So nav basically allows us to specify that. So we could say, okay, things that are underneath nav. Again, when we hover over anchor tags in nav, then right. And so now, yes, we see that, and notice here, nothing. Okay. So putting together a bunch of those ideas. All right. Oop, no, it's not what I wanted. Okay. Let me show you a tag that I just found out about last night. But I thought it was really, really cool. And so there's a tag called detail. Anybody heard of this tag? Like I said, I hadn't. I just learned about it last night. Let's see, which one is it now? There's a side two. Right. Whoop. Does that not? Let me see. Now I'm curious. It might be. Oop, no. Does Chrome not do it? No. Yeah, I have it open in Chrome. Let's see. Why is that? This is it. Is it plural? Yeah, you might be right. Yeah, I keep plural. There. Let's try that. There it is. Yes. So, details. Right? So details, the default rendering looks like that, and you can click this to automatically spin that open. So in terms of the content, you can have whatever you want. You could have pictures there, you could have additional paragraphs, all of those kinds of things. Actually, the site I was reading, they pointed to Payless Shoes is actually using this on their e-commerce site for sort of viewing the different options and stuff. So there it actually says details. Then when you add in the summary content, basically changes from details to whatever summary you decide to put in, and so forth. Kind of neat. Okay. Now, I was talking about this issue of pixels, that we don't want to specify the size of things in terms of pixels because of different screen sizes and so forth. Okay. Now, to some degree, doing what we're doing will give us a certain amount of flexibility, because when we view these things, let's see, if I take out. Oops. We can see that, yeah, as I change the my screen size, that it will roughly try to keep the 2-to-1 ratio for things. However, eventually we do get to a point where it's just ridiculous, right? At this point here, that aside is just totally in the way. Okay. And so what we'd really like to do is to move that somehow, to change our layout based on information about the device. Anybody familiar with that? What's it called? Well, right, so responsive web design is this notion of one dealing with the percentages and so forth. And it also deals with this ability to provide different views of the web page based on the properties of the device. Now, how do you find out about the properties of the device? Something called media queries. Okay. Now in CSS2, basically the only kinds of things that we could do for media queries were pretty simple. We could ask, oh, is this intended to be viewed on a screen versus viewed on a printer? And I think there were a couple of other options. There was like screen reader and something else. So there, the idea was you could, for instance, it was really common to sort of change your layout, adjust your layout, whether you were viewing it on a screen versus printing it out. You know, a good example is the click to see options. Right? If I print that out, then all I see is click to see options, and I don't see that in the printout. That's kind of weird and not terribly handy because I'm not sure how you're going to click the paper. So there, you know, if we were printing it out, we'd want to make sure that this thing was already opened. Oh, incidentally, I keep doing that. What it is about that icon that really is just drawing me to it. Let's see if I remember right. You can specify that that is open by default using this attribute. Yes. Okay. So again, based on in that particular context, that was really all the switching that we had. Okay? Of course, between CSS2 and CSS3, these things became popular, and iPads and so forth. So CSS was the media queries were amended so that we could query about the properties of the device. We could ask about, for instance, the screen size of the device. We could ask about the viewport of the window, etc. Some of this is actually carried over. In fact, later on I'll show you. There's a tag related to image called picture. Now, you might say, wait, why do you have an image tag and a picture tag? Honestly, I'm not sure why they didn't just extend image. But anyways, they didn't. The idea behind the picture tag is that you can couple it with media queries to provide different image options selected based on media query types of things. So we can say, for instance, I could say, for instance, that, oh, if I know that I have a double pixel density device, then I'm going to want to have this sort of bigger image in there and so forth, right? And then you can do things based on the capability. You know, does this browser support, for instance, WebP, which is Google's new little image format and stuff, etc. And again, so you can select out all of these different options for pictures and so forth, and specify them accordingly. So let's look at just a real simple example of some media queries with our page here, and kind of how we can adjust this. Okay. Now, this idea of responsive web design, RWD, there's tons of stuff on it. Just to give you an idea, if you don't know, everybody know about this site? W3C Schools, Right, if you don't, well, there it is. So there's lots of really cool stuff on here. You'll notice HTML. If you go to the CSS, so they have sort of all the standard CSS stuff. Then they have a whole thing separate on CSS3. And then notice responsive web design. Okay, so they kind of talk about doing some of these things and kind of building this up and so forth. Additionally, another one that I just found out about, let's see, web, this one. Web Fundamentals, I didn't know that this existed. I found out about this yesterday too. So Web Fundamentals is this website by Google showing you all kinds of cool stuff on designing for the web. So if you go to design and UI, right, there's animations, and then for instance responsive layouts and all kinds of content there, etc. So I'll put up the links for these on our website and everything so that you have those. Similarly, if you look for books on responsive web design, there's tons of books on these kinds of things. So responsive web design isn't new to CSS3. It's an idea that web developers have been working on as they're dealing with these problems of multiple devices, different screen sizes, different screen resolutions, different pixel densities, all of those different kinds of things. The basic idea behind that is what you want is fluid content. Okay. So one is this notion of what we see that we get here automatically from Flexbox is as I sort of expand this stuff out, notice that my content is kind of expanding and contracting accordingly. Okay, so that's actually good. I mean, and just kind of we get that for free by using Flexbox itself. Using the picture tag, we can have fluid images, right? So then we can again use the different media queries, have all those kinds of things. But eventually, you sort of get down to questions of, all right, so for instance, if I'm viewing this on a desktop computer versus on a mobile device, or God forbid, a mobile device in portrait orientation, then you really have very little screen real estate. So at that point, you need more than just this sort of fluidity. You really need to shift that design. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do with this. Okay, in this case, right, really simply, all we're going to do is we're going to grab our aside, and I'm just going to throw it down underneath the main content. Okay, that's all I want to do in the case that we're dealing with a sort of mobile device. Okay, so did it again? Yeah. There we go. I'll probably still click the damn thing. All right. So one of the things that they generally, one of the bits of advice that they will generally give you with when doing responsive web design is design for mobile first. Okay, that is, you have your rules set up initially for when you're dealing with a mobile website. Okay, so basically, what I'll do is I'll say, okay, you know what? So we've already seen that our flex direction and column basically gives us this here. Okay, so there's my default, right? So in that case, we have these those particular options, and you see there it is. Now then we need to specify. So then we need a way of choosing when it's the case that we're dealing with a different kind of device. Okay, so what I'm going to do is the following. Realistically, at this point, because of our column direction here, the Flex 1 is doing absolutely nothing for me. So I'm going to take that out altogether. And actually, we never were using those. And same thing with Flex 2. We'll leave in the paddings and so forth. All right, so now, @media. Okay. Parentheses, All right, so additional syntax for this. Okay, so I'll say not min resolution. I'm going to do min width. So this is the width of the viewport. And so the idea is if the viewport is, let's say if it's at least 300 pixels wide, then I'm going to do the following thing. So in that case, what I'll do is on the container, we will say that we'll use our flex direction row. And then for my aside, I'll do the flex 1, and for main, I'll do flex 2, like so. Bless you. Yeah, there it is. No semicolon there. Okay. So there's an example of a media query. You can also put in here the type of device. So I could say, oh, okay, if it is a screen, and then there's a couple of modifiers on that. For instance, you could say if it's not a screen and so forth. But all I'm going to say is, okay, look at if the viewport itself, okay, basically of what is displaying our web page is at least 300 pixels wide, then we're going to say we're comfortable with having this side-by-side view for things. Otherwise, basically, we're going to go top to bottom. Okay, so let's take a look. No, I don't need that. Get rid of that. Okay, so here it is. Notice. Now, as I drag this, you'll see eventually we get to a point, hopefully, maybe not. Yep, there it is. Yeah, so my 300 pixels is probably a little limiting, but right. So you notice goes. In fact, so let's make that a little bit. Let's say 500. Right, and so as I make this smaller, make this boom. There it goes. Right, and scroll down. Yeah. I'm sorry, oh, the developer tools for changing the screen size. In here?
Yeah, the top, next, yeah, there.
Oh, yes, toggle device toolbar, wait. Where?
Click that.
Yeah?
On the left.
Ah, okay.
Usually.
Yes, I can. There we go. Oh, okay. Oh, yes, look at that. Thank you. Yeah, so notice you can actually try on different kinds of devices, which I would imagine that's probably also adjusting the pixel density, so that would be a good way of also checking out the some of those selectors as well. Okay, and yeah, there we go. Notice so you can change the orientation, right? So we could say, okay, you know, and notice in that case, yeah, 375. Maybe we do want. Let's see.
You might have to like go in and out, in and out.
Yeah.
You turn it off and turn it back on.
Let's see, if it's at least 400 pixels wide, that says it's yeah, something's broken. All right. But that gives you a basic idea of using media queries. Now, okay, cool. Right. So I'm not going to talk about it today because we don't kind of have or go into it in detail. But so here's the thing: with Flexbox, I showed floats and kind of beat up on floats. It's not to say that you should never use floats. I mean, there are times when, yeah, I just need to simply sort of move this over and move one little thing over in one direction. And you know what? Yeah, use a float for that. That's fine. If you want something a little more powerful, then you're probably going to look at something like Flexbox. Okay. If you want something industrial strength, right? If you're coming from print design, for instance, take a look at a newspaper, right? A newspaper basically is laid out on the principle of columns. Okay? That is, that you have several small columns and various things that may actually span multiple columns. What's known typically as sort of a grid design. You can build that yourself using some of these tools. You can build it using Flexbox, you can do some things with divs, you can do, with floats, and so forth. But generally, as you start to get more complicated, really, you're better off outsourcing that. And what I mean by that is, look, experts have already done this for you. Meaning, they've solved all the hard problems, like, does it work on every browser going back to the Stone Age? And so forth. So one such entity is this. How many people have heard of Bootstrap? A bunch of you, right? So if you haven't, so you guys that have heard, where does Bootstrap come from? Yeah, it comes from Twitter, right? People who have been doing some web stuff for a while. So generally they've thought long and hard about putting stuff, displaying content up and all of that. You'll notice, right, so it says Bootstrap is the most popular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript framework for developing responsive mobile-first projects on the web. So it does have, not only does it have HTML and CSS, it also has some JavaScript in it as well that actually takes care of stuff. But just to kind of give you an idea, so there's a bunch of things that actually happen once you've installed it. So if you go to components, you'll see basically this glyph icon, so there's a whole icon set that essentially gets loaded that you can just use. So again, these are just there and you'll be able to use those. So you can go through here, you see, drop downs, button groups, and you can kind of you start to get an idea of what their various components are going to look like. If you haven't looked at Bootstrap, as you start looking at the components, what you will find is, hey, that looks like a lot of websites that I use. Because they actually are, right. Bootstrap is used as sort of the base for lots of in-production code. So nice little, all these kinds of buttons that you see on almost every website these days. So they've done a lot of the work for you already. Breadcrumbing, right, there you go, for that. Let's see. So there's a bunch of these different components and so forth that you can certainly take a look at for defining. And most of them, you can see, they basically rely on classes, right? So here's different labels. So we have span, okay, class label default. That's how they do this one, right? Here's how they get the primary label. Here's how they get right, etc. And so you can see now the other thing that this that Bootstrap has, and a lot of these. There's another one. There's a bunch of these. There's like the HTML5 boilerplate. Bootstrap has the there. Yeah, Bootstrap 4 is coming. It's right on the cusp of being released. It's in very late alpha stages. So I would imagine by the end of the semester, it should be actually out in production and all of that. One of the things that you will usually see in these startup frameworks is something called a normalizing CSS. Or a CSS reset. Okay. What is that? What's that?
Does it get rid of all the
Yeah, right. So the idea is all the browsers have their default rules for styling various elements. The problem is those default rules aren't exactly the same. Okay. There's some differences in terms of the different browsers and how they render particular components. So one approach to trying to get a unified look across all browsers is what you start with is a reset CSS page that basically strips all the default formatting from any browser that's viewing it, and then builds up from there. Okay. Now, if you're listening to me going, oh my God, that sounds like it's going to be so much work. It isn't, because they then insert their own defaults. As you saw all the various components and so forth. They insert their own things on top of that, but they start with basically sort of a common base level to make things work almost identically on all browsers. Okay. These days, the web developers it used to be the case that web developers were striving for sort of 100% pixel for pixel identical pages across browsers. They realized, I think, after lots of developers committing suicide, that wasn't a realistic goal. That, if we can get them pretty close, that's good. And so that's generally what these frameworks will give you. They basically will give you reasonably close content on the different browsers. And again, typically we'll have appropriate polyfills and so forth to try to get the stuff to work in as many contexts as possible. Okay, so using something like this for real production level code generally is a good thing. Okay, that's it for today. See you next time.